Let's go to the Lord in silent prayer for our hearts and our minds to receive His word. Amen. Well, the Christmas holiday is over, and along with all the lights and the presents and the shopping and the carols, I'm sure that many of you spent a lot of time with family. As you know, we went up to my parents the weekend of Thanksgiving, and my brother and my sister were there, mom and dad, the whole gang was there. And then we went to Megan's family too, and at her brother's house, and they had a house full as well. Now, my mom is pretty organized, and she had the whole weekend pretty planned out with all the activities, when we would eat, what we would eat, when we would open presents, what games we would play, who was sleeping where, when people went to sleep, everything. So it was all planned out. And all those parts are really wonderful. But I think my favorite part is late at night, after the kids are all nestled in bed, asleep. Right, boys? You guys were asleep, and the adults just sat around and talked. And eventually the talk would drift to stories of our childhood. And they're usually stories that we've shared and told many times. And as I get older, and the odds of me actually getting punished diminishes, I can get pretty bold with my stories. In other words, I might include parts that my parents never really knew about. Or at least I didn't think they knew about. That happened to me a couple times. They're like, yeah, we knew. And in other words, since my brother and my sister are there too, it's a lot of fun to hear the different perspectives, to hear the different versions of the same stories. And sometimes the stories are similar, but sometimes the stories are just completely different. And that's because all the stories that we share come from a different point of view. My sister is 7 years younger than me. So her point of view is way different than mine. She's remembering those stories through the lens of a kid in elementary school. And my perspective is from a punk teenager that thinks he's invincible and knows everything. So my point of view is a little bit different. And my brother, who's 4 years older, he remembers stories from a more mature and responsible perspective. And well, that's not true. From a, not really more mature, from an older perspective, I guess is what we can say. And my parents remember things from an entirely different perspective altogether. My mom remembers all sorts of minor details that no one else would think is important, but my mom remembers all those details. And my dad remembers what mom tells him to remember, basically. Yeah. And the point is, the same story can sound radically different based on who's telling it, and based on their perspective and their point of view. But it's the same story, just with different things emphasized. And the same thing can happen, or did happen, with the story of Christmas from the Bible. There are 3 different versions, 3 different perspectives, different things emphasized in each one. If it was my family, it probably would have sounded something like this. I would have told my parents, you know, now that I'm older and you can't ground me anymore, You won't believe what happened when I was out past curfew the other night. My buddies and I were hanging out at the Walmart parking lot, because that's what we did, which is stupid, but that's what we did. And we saw this huge bright star, and we heard all these angels singing. Or my brother would probably have a different perspective. He would have said something like, I was working the late shift at Dairy Queen, being responsible and earning money for college, and a car full of angels pulled up through the drive-thru and told us what was going on. And then my sister, who was in elementary school at the time, probably would have said something like, well, I was upstairs in my room reading my Sweet Valley High books, or my Babysitter's Club books, and all of a sudden I saw angels coming and announcing the good news, and so I sat quietly and I analyzed and interpreted what they were saying like a good little girl, and on and on and on. So there's different perspectives to the same story. Let's take a look at the real versions of the Christmas story from the three different perspectives from the Bible. And I know that we've heard a lot of these verses on Christmas Eve, and that's the point. And I want them to be familiar. They are familiar, and I want to kind of talk about where the different perspectives come from and why they are so different. But let's start with the first verses from John. And I know we've read this on Christmas Eve, but it's a good place to start. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. In verse 14 it goes on to say, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, John is the third time that we hear the Christmas story in the Bible. It's the same story again we heard on Christmas Eve, the story with the manger and the shepherds and the angels. It's the same story that Matthew tells in his gospel, with Joseph's dreams and the wise men and the flight to Egypt. But the point of view is different. The point of view is different, and John's version sounds completely different from the typical nativity story. And that's because different people are telling the same story. Now Luke, whose story that we are probably most familiar with, the familiar story that we have on Christmas Eve, he was more of a historian. And he was concerned with getting dates and rulers correct and locating everything in a specific time and a specific place. And he was also concerned about the role of people that were like him. He was kind of like an outsider. And he focused on these outsiders. Luke was more concerned with the shepherds and their point of view. Because shepherds were, at that time, considered social outcasts, kind of the bottom rung on the social ladder. And he was more concerned about their reactions than the reactions of kings. And Luke also focuses on the perspective of Mary. And that was also kind of a radical move, since women were considered even lower than shepherds at that time. But again, his focus was on outsiders. His focus was on social outcasts. But we have Matthew, and Matthew was more traditional. He was a Jew. He might have even been a scribe. He was very concerned with making it clear that Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament prophecies, and he was the Messiah. He was the King of the Jews. So the shepherds didn't interest him as much. But the royal wise men, the Magi, he paid a lot of attention to them. He paid a lot of attention to the flight to Egypt. because of the parallel with that and the exodus of Moses and the return from Egypt back to Israel. And so Matthew also was interested in the point of view of Joseph. And he talks about Joseph's point of view, which was more traditional than focusing on Mary at the time. And when we hear the traditional nativity story, we kind of hear a mashup of all of those things, where we have the shepherds and the magi, everyone at the manger. And I do think that's okay. It makes the story more human, more relatable. But at the same time, it can make us miss the point that each person was trying to make. And if we look at the background, it helps us understand their points of view a little bit more. At the beginning of Matthew, he focuses on Jesus' ancestry. And he reflects on how Jesus fulfilled Israel's story. He highlights Jesus as this David-like figure with his birthplace in Bethlehem and his links to David as a direct descendant. And this gives Jesus more credibility in the eyes of the people that were living at the time. Joseph hears from angels through Old Testament prophecies that were going to be fulfilled by Jesus. And the whole account from Matthew is littered with references to the Old Testament that highlight the Jewish roots that Jesus has. And the Magi coming show once again the importance of Jesus as the King of the Jews. But the focus of Luke is different. His focus is to show how Jesus was different than John the Baptist. He has a whole section on that, how Jesus is different than John the Baptist. The author, Luke, goes on to show through great pains how John's identity was to make ready for Jesus, to make ready the people so they can be prepared for the Lord, and that Jesus was a prophet of the Most High. The shepherds were told, "A Savior has been born to you. He is the Messiah, the Lord." And Luke goes on and on to identify who Jesus is. And if there's any doubt who Jesus is, Luke finishes the nativity story with an account of a visit to Simeon, who described Jesus as God's salvation. So a main purpose for Luke was to show the identity of Jesus. But Luke also stresses how God keeps his promises. Luke emphasizes over and over again how Jesus is a fulfillment of the promise of God. He highlights this example, this idea of promises, with every character that he brings up. He says that Mary is promised that she will bear the Messiah, and the shepherds are promised that a Savior has been born, and Simeon is promised that he will see the Messiah before he dies. So this idea of God fulfilling promises is an important point of view for Luke. So Luke and Matthew each told the story for a specific purpose, for a specific audience, especially for a specific audience at the time. And then we have John, and he was more of a theologian and spiritual. He doesn't seem as concerned with historical details. Instead, he writes of the meaning of Jesus' birth. And he writes from a very spiritual perspective. a perspective of fulfilling prophecy, a perspective of the big picture. He's more metaphorical, but he's still telling the same story. All three are talking about the same birth. All three are saying the same thing. Now, John's version begins much earlier, and he reminds us that Christmas really begins where Genesis begins. He even says that, in the beginning. In the beginning with God, with creation. So he uses a language that reminds us of Genesis. And John begins talking about the beginning, about the Word of God. And the Word here is God in action, God creating, God revealing himself. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then he tells the Christmas story. And he tells it in 9 words. He says, "And the Word became flesh and lived among us." 9 words. That's it. And it completely sums it up. "And the Word became flesh and lived among us." But he doesn't even mention the crowded inn. He doesn't mention the angels, the shepherds. He doesn't mention Mary or Joseph. It would make a really short nativity play if we use John's version. And we wouldn't have near as many Christmas carols if that was the only version we had. It kind of removes that human element, that we can relate to it element. But John does explain who Jesus is and who Jesus became. He says he was with him, with God in creation, the one who is God revealing himself to humanity. This one became a person, became flesh, as completely human as you and I. Not God with a people suit on, or not a really good person who God rewarded and made him special. Not a super angel that God created early on and saved up for Bethlehem. But a person who was the Word, who was God's own self. And the poetry and symbolism that John uses helps us to truly understand that meaning. What an artful, creative way to explain it. But it's still the Christmas story. It's still the same story that Matthew told. It's still the same story that Luke told. It's still the story of the birth of Jesus. So we have all these different perspectives and all these different styles. We have different points of views and different intended audiences. But for us now, for this audience 2,000 years later, it's also helpful to look at what these stories have in common. That Jesus came to us as a human. But they all have something else in common. And I referred to this a few Sundays ago, but I used the prophecy of Isaiah as my text for that sermon. So we can even add Isaiah into this mix of the same story, but with different styles and different points of view. Because all of the stories talk about light. All of the stories talk about light. They all talk about light. The light of the star, the light that shone around the shepherds. The true light that enlightens everyone. The light that is shining on those who live in darkness. There's no better image. There's no better image of what is going on. The light shines in the darkness. That's what John says. And somehow we understand this. And we understand that this truth cannot be better expressed by any other words. And like we talked about before, we know what it's like to live in darkness. We know what it's like to feel helpless. We know what it's like to feel hopeless. but we also know what it's like to see the light, to be exposed to that bright, shining light after spending time in darkness. What John and Luke and Matthew and even Isaiah, what they all say about Christmas is that a light begins to shine. Suddenly, quietly, but with an absolute certainty. And by that light, we can begin to see. By that light, we can begin to see who we are. We can begin to see who we were created to be. The birth of Jesus as a human finally made the light shine. It made everything clear. In him we see what our lives are made of and how our lives are made whole by surrendering to his love and to surrendering to his service. In him we see what it really means to be alive with a loving God and loving our neighbors. In him we see that hope never dies, and we see that we are never abandoned. And also, by that light that has come into the world, we begin to see God clearly for that first time. John says, no one has ever seen God, but God is made known to us in Jesus. So everything we thought about God, everything we had figured out, everything that we were sure that we knew about God, all of that is shown to us in Jesus. Who God is in relationship to us is fully revealed in Jesus. Everything about Jesus shows us who God is. His birth, his life, his ministry, his death, his resurrection. Through all of these things together, we finally have the light to see God. The light of Christ. The Word made flesh, comes to us at Christmas. And we celebrate his coming into the world, that God had revealed himself and his love to us in Christ. Now, that first Christmas, from all the different points of view, all the different points of emphasis, all the different perspectives, are all telling us a story about light. A light that was born long ago, but continues to shine. It continues to allow us to see, to show us a world living in darkness. What can we see? For by that light we have been given the power. We have been given the power to become children of God and to take our place with that light. The light that shines in the darkness, and the darkness that did not overcome. Amen. Now let's all